science. I'm just going to quickly show you that on the class website there is a handout that will also be posted in Schoology that will clearly articulate the modules that we cover, the handouts, the actual Google slide presentation that's not just the video, and some additional resources that you don't have to look at or use, but they might be useful if you're confused on a topic or you want to extend your learning. Up here also is just the note-taking 101 in terms of how you can take notes with each module, and some different examples about that. So let's get into today's learning, and just to be clear, this is the first one. It might not be as short or as long as necessary. It might be too detailed, and I still have yet to figure out how to fully embed multiple choice questions throughout the presentation. So most of our modules are going to start off with some unknown or some question or something that's connected to what we're learning about, but you might not be quite sure what this is. So these are 4 images of the same location, and I just want you to, in the question option, jot down some ideas about what you think this is, where you think it is, and clearly based on some of these images, it's sort of derelict. It's not in use. So think about, why did this location, this site, close? What caused it? So we're going to talk about that and other things today, thinking about just broad environmental sciences. So the things that I want you to be able to do at the end of this sort of reading and lesson is that you can define and explain what ecosystems and environmental sciences are and why they're important to humanity, and also think about the different ways humans influence ecosystems. There's a couple thinking questions as we go throughout this activity that I really want you to think about as it applies to the broader key concepts. Whose responsibility is it to prevent examples of human activity like depleting fisheries? Why does environmental studies include fields like history, politics, and culture? And do you think the P, A, or T of IPAT is the most important aspect of human influence? So what is environmental studies? Environmental studies is going to basically be just a series of ways to understand the systems that are interconnected in our world that include humans and affect humans. Now, within those different systems, we have living and non-living abiotic factors that influence these ecosystems. Now, part of your reading was dealing with fracking, and there's a really good video that explains what fracking is. Fracking has some abiotic factors that influence human health and ecosystems as it relates to water contamination and water health as it pertains to humans. Now, we use these environmental sciences as part of environmental studies, which we'll get into later. Our broad, basic, fundamental goal for this year is to really understand how humanity interacts and influences the environment and vice versa. Now, the series of photos I showed you earlier are actually an abandoned asbestos mine that is right north of Stowe in Eden, Vermont. Some of you might have hiked Belvedere Mountain. You can see the fire tower right above here. And this used to be a huge economic source of northern Vermont sort of industrial output. And there's several reasons why it closed and why this is a problem that we want to think about in terms of broad environmental studies. So what do we know? What needs to know about asbestos and as it relates to what environmental studies are? Asbestos was a historically important mineral that was useful for a lot of industrial uses. It's really strong, it's very flexible, it's heat resistant, it's electrical resistant, and it's a good insulator. And it really is not chemically resistant, which means it doesn't break down over time. So for a whole host of reasons, it was really useful historically in terms of exports and being produced. Now, the problem with asbestos is it's pretty flaky as a mineral, and what that means is whether when mined or when in use in households or residential buildings, really microscopic asbestos can enter the lungs, and that can cause actual types of cancer to being developed. Now, interestingly enough, we knew early in the 1930s that asbestos caused cancer and it caused deaths, but we really didn't start tracking it until the 1960s. And it wasn't until 1989 that the EPA, a government organization, put a partial ban on the use and exportation of asbestos, which really caused the economy to tank. So what we need to know about environmental studies is that there's ongoing systems and conflicting factors as to why certain things are in use or not in use, and how we sort of understand all of these. And part of that is just thinking about how does this influence the environment and how does this influence human systems. So this quarry, as seen from satellite images, is really close to recreational hiking. We have some water that was used for the processing, and this water doesn't have a filtration device, so it's connected to other water systems. And we have residential areas such as Lowell and Eden just a few miles away, so there's still the chance of contamination. An interesting thing to think about is most developed countries have banned asbestos, but the United States did not because of economic factors in terms of the costs of the ban and how many lives might be saved from it. But we can clearly see historically that those death estimates may not be actually accurate according to the EPA. So environmental studies and environmental sciences really are a multidisciplinary study with lots of different fields that help us understand different problems and different systems. Within the asbestos mine of Eden, we really can talk about geology, the location of asbestos. We can talk about the history and the economic importance of asbestos to a rural northern Vermont town. We can talk about the ecology and the biology in terms of how mining influences the plants in the water systems around it. And we can also talk about the ethics. If we know something is harmful for humans, but it's profitable, who gets to decide how and when that is in use or if it's banned? So systems and interactions are important for many different problems at many different scales. And each system and each scale of a system in terms of microscopic or maybe environmental scales all influence each other. Now, humans have a really unique ability to change systems. We're able to dig up and utilize asbestos, but we also have the capacity to understand what's the influence of using asbestos. What is the influence of asbestos pollution? So our influence really extends to multiple systems, biological systems, the health, chemical and geologic systems, and also organismal systems, really understanding how do things get influenced on an individual basis. Now, part of your reading was looking at the Cape Cod fishery collapse, and that has a whole host of different factors in terms of organismal and ecosystem factors like food for the cod or the water temperature, but also human aspects like the technology, the demand for cod, rules and regulations for how often we catch cod. So all of these different systems and all of these different factors make these problems not only complex, but also bring humanity into the hard sciences. So it's a real big blending of both hard and soft sciences. And we can see that over time, like asbestos, cod was a resource, an economic driver that either was overutilized or had problems that led to collapse. And here you can see all of these different countries in the early 1900s were really vying for cod dominance. So there was competing interests that led to that resource being over depleted. So the last thing we're going to talk about with this module is just thinking about what is the influence of humans on systems. Clearly, we've talked about asbestos mining and its impact on human health. We've talked about cod fishery and the economic necessity to compete with other countries, which led to its collapse. So there's really three main factors we can talk about when it relates to human influence. And we call that IPAT. P is the population. So what's the number of humans that share a particular lifestyle or an activity? A is affluence, or the amount of consumption or occurrence of that particular activity. And then T is technology. Technology can either limit or it can increase pollution, resource consumption, or land. Now, I've put this historical photo of Stowe. This is where the triple is now, to make you think just about IPAT as it changes over time. Now, it's pretty clear that Stowe 100 years ago probably had fewer humans skiing there, traveling there, using the mountain at one given time. The affluence, now you can think about affluence with skiing and a whole host of factors. What's the amount of energy needed to make all of the skis and the jackets and the equipment? How much resources are used to create the lifts and the food and the all of the things that go into a ski industry? And you can also think about technology. Probably this lift was powered by some relatively dirty fossil fuel. Stowe has done a lot to try and upgrade their systems in the past few years to make them more environmentally friendly. So while we had fewer skiers and possibly less consumption 100 years ago with skiing, the technology was less clean. So we can look at similar activities across P, A, and T and think about how are things changing over time, and can we make changes to a certain factor to improve the overall influence of an activity.